So first of all, just as for what is meditation, the literal word meditation that we translate as meditation in English, in the Tibetan word literally means to familiarize yourself with something. And so it means to gain familiarity. And so let's just take a general, like the general topic that we're going to talk about tonight is a type of meditation called calm abiding, is what we call it in English. The Sanskrit name is Shamata. And so what that means is to rest in a state where all of your agitated thoughts and emotions have subsided, have reached or settled into a state of peace. And so what that means in terms of the word familiarization is that you're kind of getting used to being in that state. You're trying to develop a habit or a familiarity with that state and build upon that until that becomes a habit for you, until that becomes like your natural way of being. And so when we think about that, the word familiarization and meditation and for what that is, I think that another important point is that when you engage in a path of meditation, I mean, first of all, it depends upon your own motivation, like what's motivating you to meditate. But if you want to make some real change within yourself, you want to make some kind of personal development, you want to develop that sense of peace, it means you have to follow through with something. So I see a lot of people these days listening to guided meditations, doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that, listening to an app here, or even on one app, doing a lot of different meditations. And while that's helpful and in the moment maybe gives you a little bit of a sense of peace or relaxation, when you're jumping around in a lot of different techniques and playing around or, gaining familiarity a little bit with this and then a little bit with that, it's really hard to make any progress. It's really hard to develop something. And so in our tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, it's considered very important to start on a path and follow through on that path until you gain the results of that before you move on to the next thing. And so it's not to say that you shouldn't read about other things or study other things or learn other things, but you have to focus on something if you want to develop that thing. And so the two main types of meditation that we generally talk about in Buddhism are this calm abiding, what I just mentioned before, which is really just resting. It's not about seeing something special or thinking about something special or trying to develop some very special or different state of mind. It's just resting. It's just stillness. And that stillness can be combined or joined in other practices. But in the first, you're just trying to develop and rest in that state of stillness, in that state of calm, peace, tranquility, whatever word you want to use. That same word for calm and calm abiding is sometimes translated as tranquil abiding, calm abiding, peaceful abiding. And so that practice is developed usually by focusing your mind on some object. And so the way that you do that, first, generally, you'll start by focusing on your breath. And that's what we're actually going to learn tonight. And I know a lot of people have done breath meditations before, but there's a very specific technique in Buddhism and some very specific aspects of that. It's not just merely focusing on your breath and watching it come and go. There's a lot more to it, which we'll get into in a little bit. First, I'm just letting you know that that's the first kind of level of calm abiding. The second level is to focus on some object, an external object. So often in the Buddhist tradition, we'll use an image of the Buddha. And often on these images of the Buddha, there's a spot in the middle of the forehead. Some people might call it a third eye or something like that, but that's not really what it is in the Buddhist tradition, but we can just call it that for ease of discussion. So you'll focus in on that spot. And you are using your eyes, obviously, because it's a visual object, but the point is to focus your mind on that object. So you first focus on the breath, then you focus on an external object. And then when you've developed familiarity with that, some stability in that, meaning that your mind can focus in that object for an extended period of time without getting totally distracted, then you'll move on to even dropping the physical external object and move on to either a visualized object, like you could visualize the Buddha in the space in front of you, or sometimes you imagine it in your heart. And what's happening now is your mind is getting a capacity to rest in a more subtle way, because it's easier to rest on an external object because that object is there. You can look at it. It's stable. It's sitting there. When you no longer have some external object as your support, you're relying upon a more subtle level of stability to gain or to remain focused on the object, because the object itself is no longer something stable and physical and tangible. It's now also kind of part of your mind, you could say. It's something that you are visualizing or imagining in your mind. So it's actually harder to focus on that. It's a more subtle state of mind, which you're focusing in that state. So that's a deeper level of this practice. And then an even deeper level of that is to drop the objects altogether. And then you're just focusing, you could say focusing mind on mind, or on deeper levels, that becomes a situation where there isn't really something looking at something else. I know that might be a little bit hard to understand right now. We don't really need to understand that point right now. It's talking about some very advanced levels of practice. But at first, basically what we're talking about is a level of focused attention, calm focused attention, which is becoming more and more and more subtle and more calm, more and more calm. And to try to jump straight to the more subtle level for most people isn't going to work. And this is where that word familiarity comes in. We're developing that capacity. We're becoming more and more habituated. We're growing our skill set. We're growing our habituation or familiarity with that peaceful state. And when we do that, then our mind is able to rest with less and less reliance upon some other thing, like an external object, focusing on the breath, an internally visualized object, and so forth. You're gradually relinquishing your need for some other thing to allow you to be in a state of peace. So, but in the beginning, you need those things. We need to work through those steps to get to the point where we no longer need those things and we can just be in that state. Just trying to drop everything and be in that state, we're probably going to maybe be in that state for a few seconds before we just start thinking again and falling back into our other habits. So that, again, that word familiarity or familiarization comes up. What are we already familiar with right now? Right now, we're familiar with allowing our thoughts to run free, allowing our emotions and thoughts to overpower us to the point where we are not really in control. Like, we might have certain goals, we might have certain intentions, but we're driven by the force of habituation. And so what we're doing is trying to make a new habit. We're trying to familiarize our mind in a different direction. Instead of just constantly following every thought that comes up, we are trying to allow some space, to allow those thoughts to settle and to subside. And eventually, what we're working towards is not just being able to do that when we decide to sit down and meditate, but allowing that experience to continue in our normal day-to-day life outside of just a formal sitting meditation session.